All right, welcome back. And I'm going to hand it over to this amazing people.
Hi everybody, so welcome back. I am Stephanie Carroll, so see that Pakistan, that's Stephanie Carroll, to Susa, I'm with Ahtna. I am Ahtna, like Renee from the native village of Taitingfong on the Copper River in Alaska, so we turn the Copper River Statement. That's where I'm from. And I am at the University of Arizona, and I'm here to talk with Riley and Keolu today and kind of bring the whole conversation back to how do the label of notices through local context and all of these fantastic applications that you've seen today enhance and uplift Indigenous sovereignty, specifically around data. And so I'm going to give some basics because we like slammed right into it, and we'll talk a little bit more about the power of repositories for doing this work, and then some critical issues that we need to think about moving forward. And so I like to talk about data from an Indigenous perspective, thinking about anything that relates to us as individuals and collectives. And we expand beyond the Western definition by thinking about data as basically anything that can be digitized. So today that's information, knowledge, specimens, and so forth. And really it's in these kind of three categories. And so what Indigenous aspirations around data really do is bring us back to thinking about the links between land, and I use land as capital land as they do in what's now known as Canada today, to think about all of the relations around land, so our non-human kin, so that can be water, soil, so forth, about us as people, and then about our worldviews, so our languages, and so weaving together and repatriating, reclaiming, and expressing these relationships between land, people, and language, which are foundational and fundamental to Indigenous peoples. So Indigenous data sovereignty then is the right of Indigenous peoples to govern the collection, ownership, application of their own data. So this really draws upon, as I've had actually more than one tribal elder tell me, making what's old new again. So thinking about those roles and responsibilities and the protocols we have in our communities and translating them into the digital environment. And then leveraging the tools that we have. And so, for instance, local context, labels and notices are one set of tools, but also other tools are things like the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, federal recognition, other relationships you might have, to be able to express that. And so Indigenous aspirations around data really work to push back around the norm by thinking beyond the digital context about how do we perpetuate these relationships that we have in this digital environment, and then also beyond the geographic scope of mainstream data sovereignty. So mainstream data sovereignty is really bound by these geographical jurisdictions and nation states, right? But we want to maintain our relationships with our data wherever they may be. And so Indigenous data governance is a way to do that. And so one of the things that we've heard referred to today are the CARE principles for Indigenous data governance. And these came out of the need to be able to understand and move forward with Indigenous rights and interests as we're moving towards this vast data landscape. And so we have lots of data, we have mandates around open science and open data, and we have the need to maintain and actually increase our relationships with data throughout time. And so the CARE principles of collective benefit. So how do Indigenous peoples benefit from data, and how is that benefit built into data ecosystems, data infrastructure, and so forth, and how is it equitable then in terms of being able to benefit from those data on their own terms. Authority to control, which really thinks about rights, governance, and the need for data for governance. and the responsibility. And so a lot of people interpret this responsibility as the responsibility of researchers or communities to build and enhance community capability and capacity, but there's a responsibility on researchers and institutions, like we've heard today in a lot of the conversations, to also build up their own capacity and capability to do this work in the right way. But fundamental to this responsibility piece is a responsibility to Indigenous worldviews and Indigenous languages, and making those core and central to the work that's being done. And finally, with ethics, it is a reference to the ethics of the communities. And so the CARE principles are these high-level principles. They're international, global in scope, and they always point down to the community. And so what they're telling you to do as an institution, as a researcher, as a repository, is to establish those relationships with the communities to whom the data that you have or that you're collecting relate to or link to. And so fundamentally what they do is bring to the data discussion, and this was actually by design, the people and purpose of data, so that when we're using other principles like the FAIR principles, which are now everywhere in data. So those principles are to enhance data itself so that it's more shareable. And so it can be seen as being weaponized at times to make open the kind of mantra. But in fact, the mantra is as open as necessary, as open as possible, as closed as necessary. And so we need to remember that. And that is something that even I hear federal agencies say. Because what happens when you get down into institutions, I know at my university sometimes, is that people tell you you have to make your data open because there's a mandate. That's not actually true. The mandate is that you have to do it in relation with the people whose data it is. And so this is a foundational aspect of it. So the CARE principles were put out by the Global Indigenous Data Alliance, which we've heard reference to today, which Maoli and I worked very closely with. I'm actually the chair, and he's my co-chair by voluntold positions, basically. And so we put out the CARE principles in 2019, and we have two initiatives this year that we've come out with. One is a discussion about the rights that Indigenous peoples express in relation to their data. And so this paper just came out last week, and it's open access. And it talks about these 12 rights, and we bucketed them by data for governance and governance of data, and how Indigenous peoples are expressing those rights. And now it's the point where we need to think about what does that mean for institutions, and acknowledge that you're not going to see all of these rights expressed in every situation. And every institution can't handle all of these rights yet. So where do we make movement forward? And then one of the other efforts that we have, and you'll see how this resonates with the Global Indigenous Data Alliance, is really having these broad spectrum advances to promote the rights of Indigenous peoples at a very high level internationally. So we have for the past 3 years, Jane and Maui and myself, and then our friend Keolu has been working with the group at the IEEE, which is the Institute for Electronics and Electrical Engineers. In detail, but they're one of the major standard setting bodies for data. And so we're creating the first data standard for Indigenous data. And this is around provenance. And we're at the point of having consultation with Indigenous peoples now through September. And we hope to have this recommended practice out by early 2025. And this is a continued effort to be able to make these very high level movements so that we have uptake at various scales. And so what you have is international uptake. So the UNESCO recognition of open science has the CARE principles in it, and Maui and I are both involved in the efforts moving forward with that about how to assess how that's going. And then you see nation state efforts. So for instance, in Australia, they have the Australia IATSIS Code of Ethics for any research with Australia, with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders in Australia, and that includes fair care in it, and is actually a way to refuse research being done if it's not following fair care. And then you get down to the nation state level. So here in the US, one of the rich practices we have are research review boards, but also tribal codes and other tribal policies that clearly set out the standards for interacting with Indigenous research and data on lands. And at this point, I'm going to transition to Riley.
Okay. What has been off the days? What is time to? Obviously, Riley Taitingfong. My name is Riley Taitingfong. I'm from CHamoru, which means my homelands are Rabbit Islands, specifically the island of Guam or Guam in the Marianas in the Pacific. I'm a postdoc who has the great pleasure of working with Stephanie Carroll, Jane Anderson, Mara Hudson, and others, especially thinking about implementation of care across different settings. I'm located at the Native Nations Institute at University of Arizona. Okay, so I'm just going to take a few minutes to tell you about some of the projects we're doing now and thinking about really moving care, the care principles from sort of a framework to practice. And the first aspect of this we're going to talk about is the implementation of care data repositories. So right now we have been building a collaboration, a consortium with our use case partners at ASU Collections and also our friends here from University of Maine DDNA. And so we're working together to develop a series of phases for thinking about what does it look like for institutions, for repositories, for researchers to really enter into the work of care implementation in their settings and to do that in a good way. And so we've conceptualized this along a series of 6 phases so far, starting with what we're calling phase 0, which is about institutional preparation. We're calling it phase 0 to really emphasize this sort of foundational pre-work that needs to happen at your institution or repository before you can begin to think about how to implement care. And so some key activities at this phase would include kind of engaging in necessary learning on Indigenous data sovereignty and Indigenous data governance and the care principles. Thinking about how to sort of evaluate and assess your setting for care implementations or readiness. So thinking about what resources you have to implement care, thinking about the technical infrastructure, different existing policies and practices around data sharing and the degree to which those may sort of enable and align with care implementation or maybe the intention with that work. Additionally, we recognize that the work of care implementation cannot be done by any single individual alone. So we really emphasize at this phase establishing some kind of a Indigenous data governance working group or other network of champions and resource folks who can help you kind of mobilize action towards care implementation. And across the different phases, I'll also talk about something we're thinking on, which is kind of scaling considerations. So what does it mean within any of these phases to start thinking about different kinds of levels of scale? Okay, and then so going on to phase 1, this is really focusing on disclosures of rights and interests. So this is, for repositories to leverage key practices and tools to disclose, or in other words, make visible and transparent the existence of Indigenous data within their collections. So different activities that would happen at this phase include the implementation of things like the institutional notices, creation of ethics statements, Indigenous data sovereignty statements, including new Indigenous data sovereignty or governance agreements within your particular setting. And as scaling considerations at this phase include thinking about different infrastructure capacities to kind of carry out these activities. Okay, for phase 2, this is really focused on policies and practices. So thinking about what policies and practices will implement care across your institution or repository, both for data that exists already and new data collections. And so in this stage, we're taking activities like implementation of those statements, different permissioning guidelines, documentation of permissions, redesign of deposit slips, policy briefings, and scaling considerations get us into things like provenance, metadata fields, data management policies and flows, and thinking about compliance with the NCOYA protocol. Going to phase 3, this is thinking about, especially with the work around repositories, that there's sort of a good fruitful site for intervention for this kind of work because they interface with so many other kinds of data actors and institutions. So in phase 3, we're really focusing on integrating the development of those policies, practices, and trainings across those different settings with which repositories interact. So thinking of things like funders, publishers, researchers, universities, metadata fields, and aggregators, and scaling considerations, in this case, thinking about maintaining provenance across aggregators, repositories, as well as the scaffolding of tribal, institutional, and government policies. Okay, and we're still in the process of working with our partners to develop the last 2 phases, so phase 4 and 5, still under construction. But we're realizing the need to build in considerations around sustainability and persistence. So once you have some of these practices in place, what does it look like to really sustain those efforts over time, including when some of those practices may not be sort of mandated by different external entities. So we're starting to think more deeply on this, but Peers for Action might include different kinds of standards and assessments. Okay, and then lastly, also still in development, is thinking about integrating systems across repositories. So building these kinds of broader networks of care, full repositories committed to the application of care, and of course also in conjunction with care, the care principles. Okay, and then the other kind of arm of the work we're doing for care implementation is thinking about building criteria for the care principles. And so this is an effort that we're working with different folks across our kind of different scales of networks. So folks who've been really involved in with Stephanie and others in developing the initial care principles, thinking about how we can develop a criteria to evaluate how those principles are being enacted or implemented in different settings. And so for this work, we've been, or others I should say, I just showed up to that very recently, have been in a process of sort of analyzing how these different institutions, different repositories are implementing care on the ground. And this has involved looking at the kinds of statements made from these organizations and institutions about their data management practices with respect to care, and also secondary document analysis. And so we're thinking about taking some of these practices and turning them into different indicators that can then be used to kind of evaluate the degree to which sort of the practices are aligning to the care principles and sub-principles are here on the slide. So I'm just going to give you one brief example of what that looks like, but for the A principle or sub-principle 1.1, for example, is recognizes Indigenous people's right and interest in their knowledge of data. And so the group had been looking at work from LICHI, which is the local indicators of climate change. All right. Observant is something different. All of the acronyms that we have to hold in our brain. So looking at the great work that they're doing at LICHI to enact this principle. So they have a statement from some of their work, recognizing that Indigenous peoples have distinct rights under UNDRIP, as Stephanie talked about, and kind of positioning their responsibilities and practices that are in place in their platform to respect free, prior, and informed consent. And so analyzing that, our group is thinking about how we can then translate that into an indicator that can be used to give others examples of how to actually move these principles to practice. Okay, I think we will leave it there and pass it now to Professor Keolu.
I'm Keolu, and I realized that I only have like 10 or 15 minutes, and I was extremely ambitious about the number of slides. So I'm just gonna go all the way. I'm gonna go here. I'm gonna start here. I'm gonna start here. Okay, so this is a plot. I'm a human geneticist. I work in genome sciences, and I'm mostly focused on human genomes. But I wanted you guys to zero in on 2 things. So here we see that the vast number of human genomes that have been sequenced of individuals with Western European ancestry, which, given our healthcare system and history of colonialism in this country, should not be a surprise. but the statistic that is far more concerning is at the bottom there. And that is that 72% of these studies have taken place in 3 countries. America, the UK, and Iceland. And yeah, but Iceland was weird, but they have a lot of capacity for students, right? And what's far more concerning when you look at this map and you know a little bit about human history, you'll know that the lion's share of the genetic variation on planet Earth exists in the continent of Africa, specifically. And you can see that all of that information is being outsourced to those 3 countries that we talked to, right? So 72%. That's extremely concerning when we talk about capacity building and building technological independence in a lot of these developing places. And that's a huge focus of a lot of my work. And that information gets commoditized, fed directly into the broken or by design IP system. So here is Lumina. Does anybody know? Well, they are our #1 service provider. They like to think that they're the Apple of tools. The largest genome sequencing company on planet Earth. They have about a $37 billion market cap. And you can see that since 2018, over 45,000 patents have been filed in this space. Now that is before the largest in mass collection of biospecimens and surveillance data, i.e. COVID, right? So think about that. This is their headquarters, this is their cafeteria, which is weird. Okay. All of these patents that are just up there on the wall like moose heads and a hunting lodge. So you have to think about what the culture there is, what that means. I think this is a testament to how important metadata labeling is, how important this whole initiative is. So I wanted to point to that to say these are the types of things that we're trying to combat with all of these technologies that you hear about all day today. And we also know that data is the world's most valuable resource, surpassing oil in 2018, and that we have an extremely broken supply chain when it comes to DNA, its creation, where it's stored, and commoditizes it, and so on. So when you begin to think about it like a resource, you make comparisons with water, oil, timber, rare earth minerals like cobalt, you start to think about it and say, we don't want to recapitulate the previous, historical relationships with any other resource. And if you're from an indigenous community or historically marginalized community, you know what that means. This is looming, that we need safeguarding technologies, that we need deterrent technologies. And look no further than cobalt itself. Now, I choose this example because it's recently been in the news a lot. 75% of the cobalt, which powers the generation of data, because you can't really have the hardware that leads to integrated circuits without this precious resource. 75% of it comes from the Democratic Republic of Congo. Yet this community of people is getting fleeced. Their whole supply chain is broken. Meanwhile, Apple is a $1 trillion company, and this community has the highest rates of child labor, highest rates of professional sexual assault, all of these things that are really, really horrible. And I would say that supply chain is broken. That is not what we want to see in our space, right? And that's why we made all these images of Tim Cook visiting Democratic Republic of Congo, which has not happened. And the reason we're doing this is to put pressure on people like this to go and investigate the totality of their supply chain. So the tools we're talking about, and these are images from I think Mid-Journey that we made. The Getty images thing, I'm really proud of that thing. But the point is it's like these are the current techniques, right? That's what a lot of the technologies that we're creating here is putting pressure on that whole initiative. And that's why data sovereignty is so important. I'm going to kind of work through some of this stuff, and I want to get you most important. That data is really important, but also thinking about vertical integration in all of the places where we can enter things. So if you saw Crystal's talk, she talked a lot about how we built the Native Biodata Consortia and how our focus is on bringing sequencing capacity and everything from where we store data to how we process it. All of this is on reservation land, and we need more access to things like this, vertical integration. From the development of the Model T to Amazon, who will literally send a semi truck to your laboratory to pick up your data because it's worth so much money. You have to protect it. You saw that already. A lot of these technologies we've talked about and published on are really interesting because they're in that space as well. And you can imagine using a lot of these tools, these metadata labeling tools to complement that workflow. And that's the hope of a lot of these technologies like the blockchain, that federated learning. But there's a problem with some of these tools, and that is that they generate a lot of data themselves. So I wanted to just kind of expedite those. And so do mobile tools, point of care technology tools. Put this slide in here purposely because I knew my friends from Tahiti would be here and see this. And this is the way that we're kind of working to collect data in different communities. That means we're collecting more data broadly, right? And Pfizer and Moderna know this. They want to bring vaccine notes to communities to eliminate cold chain. But there are consequences to all of that generating data on the fly. Supposedly, we are, by the year 2040, we would have generated 150 zettabytes of information. And there are consequences to that, right? It's not just our addiction to data on Instagram or the Internet of Things or ChatGPT. Who's used that recently? And sequencing data. I don't know if you guys saw the new papers. The genome sequencing space came out today, but they are multi-dimensional genomes that have been represented. And that means that, again, it requires more data processing and storage per genome. And there are consequences. And they are not independent of the laws of thermodynamics, which means when you have data centers that store data, they're constantly emitting heat right now, as we speak, as you go to sleep. And this exponential addiction to data is not good for the environment. So we can't sit up here and say, we want to adopt all of these new tools and also be indigenous when we know that indigeneity and sustainability are synonymous. And according to my dad, we're generating so much data that we're cooking the planet. And that's highly problematic. So inspired by some of those ideas, and my partner in crime for this project is named Eric Dawson, who works at NVIDIA, and he's sick today, so he couldn't be here, but he lives in New York, which is sad to be here. But we generated, I don't know, that the bottom plot is the one you should be looking at. And we've generated a new series of predictions and estimates, kind of back of the envelope predictions to say, when is the moment when massively parallel computation itself will surpass combustion engine production of CO2? Will that happen in our lifetimes? And I got into a huge argument with him. Turns out it is going to be in our lifetimes. And it's likely that it's going to be around or before the year 2040. So our attention to detail on our addiction to oil might need to be shifted in a different direction. And we have to think about the new types of technologies that we sponsor in the types of research that we do here. Are we going to be supporting perspectives on Earth-friendly computation? We should be, because this is a looming problem that's going to make every aspect of their lives more difficult. And so I've highlighted a whole bunch of new things. This thing rendered funny, but this is the table that I came up with last night. Who's familiar with NASA readiness levels? Anyone? So when NASA comes out with new technologies, they like to come up with the feasibility. It's like, how far away from this is this on a scale of real to science fiction? Where are we in terms of the application of this? And these are a number of different techniques that can be used to reduce the carbon footprint of computing. Now, we could use initiatives like local context to put pressure on institutions like Amazon Web Services and Google and Microsoft. And I think that's something we should do in the future. And that maybe something that we champion and prioritize. But here you can see there's many different perspectives, and I've included my own estimates of the readiness levels for a lot of these technologies, like, I don't know, sustainable aspects to mitigating heat or saltwater air conditioning, which I learned about when I was in Tahiti, which actually comes from boiling. For cooling, or one I put on the bottom, which is very much in the near future, is DNA storage. And this is the idea that you can store DNA in cells, because what is a genome if not something where you can store data? And in fact, George Church's group just did this, where they stored the first video ever frame by frame in a single cell, and it's really exciting work. So I, being a Hawaiian person, I love breadfruit, ulu from my friends from Tahiti, and I think that we have to find new ways to think cleverly about creating carbon negative computation, and that is sequestering carbon and creating oxygen at the same time. And these might be new techniques to do that. And these are other just crazy ass images of, you see breadfruit on a server rack. But that's not what I need. But I just wanted to kind of point us in that direction. So we're going to be talking about futurism, and we're going to be operationalizing futurism, and we're going to be protecting our assets. And this is definitely the direction that we should be going. So I guess I'm finished.
So Emily and I both tag teamed in and next discussion towards the finalization of the day of a lot of things. Yeah, I feel like today I'm doing it. I feel like today is this, the communities and projects and all of these experts and all of us coming together and then out in the world in all these multidimensional ways. It's also a theme that I guess, you know, we really wanted to share how much work this is, like how much work is going on, what that change means, what that change looks like, Indigenous futurisms, Indigenous innovation, the shifts within community context, but also how much time it takes and how much energy it takes. And, you know, if there's one question that kind of remains, it's about capacity and about resourcing and how and what can that look like and how can that look differently. Yeah. So just some time to open for questions or responses to both panels that you will come to this afternoon.
I love how this morning there was a question that came up in how to begin. And I wondered if in the reflection of this morning and this afternoon, I think about young people working in museums right now, and they're so acutely aware of the urgency of this work. And I think of what it means to be a young professional and seeing all this violence that happens in archives and in museums. What advice would you give to someone who sees this, maybe isn't inextricably tied to the work, but sees what's happening? I'm just curious to what advice you might give to somebody who is not speaking at the level of organizational change. They're very entry, but they need to reach for language so that they can help them change.
I mean, I guess I'm just trying to think about I hope they're having fun back there. Like most people is really like Monday. I've worked at exams before. Organizational sort of job, so hopefully they are having fun.
Right, sort of outside, I work in museums as well, and I think part because I don't know the answer, I'm asking the same question, but you have to look for your outlines, like in every single department, because it happens a little bit everywhere, and sometimes it's projects, and sometimes it's just more basic.
And I think that when you have those conversations in the hallway, you can find them, and there's probably more than they think. And I think that that's a really inspirational place to start. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's right. One of the things that when I started doing training around Indigenous data sovereignty, one of the goals was really twofold. Actually, to have people feel confident enough to be sitting at a table or walking down the hallway and to bring it up. Just not to be, like to be an expert in their own right, like in their own experience, in their own place. And to be the person who says, when you're sitting around a table and you're talking soil science and there's like 7 people around the table and everybody's going on and on, and finally you say, wait, we're Indigenous people. Like we're on their land, why aren't they here? And then tied to that is this notion of there's no wrong place to start. There's a bazillion right places to start. And so as part of that, it's you look for your allies and then you look for your opportunities.
Yeah.
And I think, I teach a lot of young museum studies students who are coming into these spaces, and it's also a belief that change is possible. And having that as one that can kind of lead connections. I think some of the work that we've been doing and that Riley and Steph just presented as well, kind of these different phases of change that can happen. And I think that's true for some of the local context work as well, like why we wanted to have projects in process. It's harder to see something that's, that's kind of completed. It's hard to see all the pieces that are being made to make that work. And I think that that's the same in these spaces, that finding those collaborations, but also activating a knowledge that change is going to be changing along the way is also really, really important.
Thinking about the continuance of that change as well. So implementation of labor application, like will be one step, and what are the multiple steps after that? Liberating those things, that is something, for example, or X.
Because maybe just tap into the documentation. What I immediately think about, when you're presenting this new technology that I'm really kind of excited and terrified by, of like storing data in genomes. But then combining that with what you said before, like this, what would the development of this project look like? Where like the care principles are not something that gets retroactively applied, but is a kind of foundational part of the making of that kind of research. I would love to kind of hear more how something like that would look like if you were, I know it's just in the beginning, but.
I think that's a sentiment that I get from a lot of people that are in this whole community. It's that should be a root of all of the technology. It shouldn't be something that's appended. Like I get the sense that's what we teach people about ethics. Also, it's okay. We 10 out of 10. You're working out the ethics lecture or whatever. I feel like that's all too often happening. But yeah, if that's at the root of it, then it'll work out much more profoundly impactful.
I think part of it too is thinking about how if you start at the root and have Indigenous worldviews and even other marginalized worldviews as part of the creation process, what will our technologies look like? What will the infrastructure look like? And how might those be different than what we see today? And so I think, when we created the care principles, the first email I got was from somebody from the EU Parliament, because they were like, oh, we're really interested in this collective notion and the collective rights aspect. Could we just take it and plop it on here and use this? And I was like, if you like this, then you need to because you need to see what other Indigenous innovations are going to come out and how that can really transform what we're doing.
So like when I think about my own data storage and what I do and how I can be a good citizen to it goes back to having my original data information stored, which is both storytelling and oral traditions. And so I think thinking about old and new processes, could it be that some of this indigenous knowledge and storage can be useful in a oral language, oral traditional base, where that is not consumption of energy, but actually energy that could be provided for others. Like you could be talking about language traditions or history or science by planting a tree. So not only are you interacting and storing knowledge, you're creating oxygen as well. So I think there is something to actually keep continuing to go deeper than just what we know now, which is like writing and visual, many of the ways to store data, which is audio too, right? So just continue going.
Yeah, what we store and how we store it, I think this will be a much less conversation. And I was thinking of something very similar in the what we used to do. And how that's a much better use of all of the conversations around land back. Yeah, land back, everybody's doing their we saw the breast dogs land acknowledgements. Yeah. It's like I'm over that stuff. If you want to talk about it, then help us buy some land back. Help us put that in the shepherd. Then it becomes okay, well, we want to build our own cloud computation and we want to store it. Well, then aren't we just a mirror image of Amazon? You know. So we have some big decisions.
This question is for you, because I want to know whether this exhibition will include information about Sacagawea, and to what extent she also helped in the collective and preservation of these memories.
Right, yeah, don't know if it's not. I know, I'm sure the project and audience has.
Yeah, and then there was also your work, less time as well. I think that's yet to be figured out. You know, I think we kind of again set the framework for what we think this exhibition could evolve to be, but definitely telling those stories. I think you know, you're gonna have to see
This guy is the one that only have enough resources.
Yeah.
What is the time?
So hopefully we'll find out in August about the NEH grant, and then it's planned for 2026, or we're in 2023. Yeah, we'll get to work right away. Yeah.
And I had a question, was there collaboration and informed consent with the Native nations whose plant knowledge is being made available in the public space?
Yeah, so that's also part of the process, you know, I mean, then now the holdings at the academy, I don't think are don't have consent behind them. So yeah, that will also have to be part of it. Yeah.
And then I'm wondering if part of the exhibit will also talk about plants and appropriation and commodification, like these current issues that Native peoples are seeing today. Like, for example, with white sage, how all of this plant is being just like taken away from the community. And even talking about indigenous foods, like, yes, it's wonderful to make all these indigenous foods make it available, but what impact does that have on the Native communities where we have limited land and how to cultivate that? And even where some of those indigenous foods are so precious where they can only be used within the context of ceremony. So also looking at what are the implications of having that knowledge out there, because eventually that knowledge becomes a commodity in this society that we live in today.
Good point. Yeah, and I mean, I think we would have a conference related to this in public programming. So some of the things that are dispersed in parks that include, you know, exhibitions are kind of limited in ways in which what they can explore. So we definitely plan to do some kind of conference around this. Yeah, good question.
So, Julie, how might one context help protect against the commodification?
This is going to be one question. Were there other audiences to comment local contexts?
Help protect against commodification against of indigenous knowledge. Yes.
I think it begins by saying and identifying that there is Indigenous knowledge in these spaces rather than assuming that there isn't, which has kind of led to so many different kinds of appropriation in the first place, and to normalize the erasure of Indigenous people and Indigenous knowledges across all these spaces. That's a lot of work. What the notices try to do is to actually, in the first instance, make transparent the ongoing persistent existence of Indigenous knowledge. And then allow for the labels to bring Indigenous authority and sovereignty to these spaces, wherein people have to partner, talk, engage with sovereign communities in relationship to the uses of that knowledge. And so it's actually changing the paradigm of what we think knowledge is, where we think knowledge comes from, whose knowledge, and kind of, it's a radical proposition to turn that around. But I think that that's the only way forward. And in many ways, the labels and the notices were brought to try and address the enormity of the appropriation of Indigenous knowledges in commercial contexts and in non-commercial contexts. And we started with museums, libraries, and archives, and we know how enormous those collections are, and how undocumented and how much poor provenance information and poor information about Indigenous people's involvement, let alone their knowledges in the first place. We kind of see exactly the same problems happening in the genomic sciences, in biodiversity, and so kind of what is it to kind of build these spaces back into a conversation with each other that kind of see the kind of core settler colonial logic of erasure playing out, and research and institutional complicity in that. And so I don't know, the labels are just one piece of a larger project against that, but they're trying to bring Indigenous presence into those spaces in a different kind of way, so that people can say, no, I don't want that knowledge used in this way, or that ethnography is not verified by our community. It does not tell you anything about us. And kind of like, what does it mean to control knowledge in a different kind of way that isn't just born out of a certain kind of settler colonial logic of settler futurity.
I think this is partly, or this is exactly what we want to see both from the summit and from this.
And I guess that's why we all do this work, is to try and make that change real. Because our traditional systems of law, for instance, aren't going to get us there. Because they weren't built to do that. They were built to do that. So. And so, you know, speaking back to the power of legal logics or settler colonial frameworks of separating knowledges and separating disciplines has not really served us very well. And so it's kind of time to try a different way.
I'm not gonna be able to quote myself, right? But it's something like fuck the silos and the separations and those determinations kind of against us, because we collectively ensure every worlding that revolves.
So I am going to do two last things. I'm going to just thank everybody for coming, for everybody who's online out there, for everybody who's joined us in person to be able to talk about this work and talk about it and share it like in person. It's so important to see each other in person. We haven't been able to do that. This is just the start of being able to do that. Thank Emily for amazing facilitation and for bringing us and grounding us through all the different sessions of the day. And I want to bringing James Francis in to kind of close us out a little bit. James Francis is another co-conspirator, tribal historian, the director of the Department of Cultural and Historic Preservation of the Penobscot Nation, but also the chair of the Local Context Council. James, I'd just like to invite you up to say a few last words, both on behalf of Local Context and the work that we've been doing, but also being here in the grounding us again.
Amazing. I've been doing this work for a long time. Knowing Jane for more than a decade, and really starting to think differently about how we approach our problems in our Indigenous communities, and really watching local context change over time. And this is truly a summit, both from what I was watching online before I got here, and then what I witnessed this afternoon. It's quite amazing that we came together in this way to share this important work. And it's amazing how much has changed through local context, but also, you know, this idea of what is possible. You know, there's, for me, it really elevates what local context is, because it's those core values of local context. You know, this idea of, you know, priority for Indigenous communities and their sovereignty and their voice, that has allowed all these different directions to kind of float around local context and to use and engage with local context in ways that I really don't think that we ever dreamed of. And this is what this summit really truly is synthesizing for me, at least personally. You know, I think it's important to think about, you know, also the amount of capacity that's needed and the work that people are doing in their own little spheres, all with this little kind of connection to local context, because ultimately, again, it's about Indigenous communities and sovereignty. And so, you know, I think when you capture something, an idea that is, for me, really local context has been really hard for me to define. And I think it's so hard to define because it's so fundamental and so meaningful and so broad and so malleable, and that all of this can happen, that it really doesn't need to be defined. It just is what it is, and people latch a hold of it. And so I just want to thank everybody for participating, whether you're online or in the rooms today at this summit. And again, this is truly, you know, I think of a summit with all these leaders coming together and sharing their ideas. And this is truly what is happening here today. And, you know, I think it's truly, you know, a benefit to local context, how you all have taken a piece of it and brought it forward. And thank you very much. And also, one last thing, join us this evening for a local context film at 6:30 downtown. Where's downtown? Thank you all.